Welcome back to the Faith Informing Podcast. My name is Travis Jamieson, and I'm your host. It's not often that a 17th century thinker feels uncannily suited for the questions of our own age, but that's exactly what we find in Blaise Pascal. In this episode, I'm joined by Graham Tomlin to explore his remarkable book, Blaise Pascal, The Man Who Made the Modern World. Pascal was a mathematician, physicist, inventor, and even a theological writer, a man who helped shape the modern imagination while also offering one of its most penetrating critiques. He lived at the dawn of modernity, yet wrestled deeply with questions that still haunt us today: the limits of reason, the restlessness of the human heart, and the hiddenness of God in a distracted world. In our conversation today, Graham is going to help us see not just the historical Pascal, but the living relevance of his thought. If you've ever felt caught between belief and doubt, or wondered how to live faithfully in a world shaped by noise, speed, and uncertainty, Pascal is a guide worth revisiting. Graham, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Travis. Great to be with you and great to be with all your listeners as well. Looking forward to the conversation today.
So tell us a little bit about yourself professionally. What do you do on a daily basis? And also, what led you to Blaise Pascal of all people?
Yeah, well, my story is that I spent most of my life in teaching academic theology. I taught theology here in Oxford because I live in Oxford right now, and I used to teach here in the University of Oxford in teaching sort of undergraduates, postgraduates, ordinands for the Church of England and others. I then went on to help found a new theological college in London called St. Mellitus College. I then became the Bishop of Kensington, so I'm an Anglican bishop in the Church of England. And but over the last few years, I've moved on to something else. 3 years ago, I moved on to become to head up a new initiative called the Centre for Cultural Witness, which is trying to think about how we communicate sort of a thoughtful, intelligent Christian faith in the kind of contemporary media landscape. And big part of that is a website called sewnandunseen.com, which tries to offer a kind of thoughtful theological commentary on what's going on in culture today, which is largely what I think Pascal was trying to do in many ways too. So Seen and Unseen is it's a podcast with lots of different articles, not so much an internal church thing. We don't write about sort of internal church politics or stuff, but we write about what's going on in culture in terms of sort of arts, sciences, politics, economics, whatever it might be, and try to bring a theological lens to that. We do podcasts and training courses and so on. So that's largely what I do. I do some work for the Anglican Communion worldwide, trying to hold that together, and I do quite a bit of writing at the moment as well. So that's kind of what I do. That's my how I spend my time. I live with my wife Janet. We spend quite a lot of time with our kids and grandkids at the moment as well. So how did I get into Pascal? Well, it was largely because when I first encountered Pascal was I was a teenager many years ago, and I remember reading the Pensée, and it kind of had an effect on me at the time, although I'm not sure I understood much of it. And then when I was thinking about doing a doctorate in theology, I'd done my initial theology degree in training to get ordained, and then I went on to do a PhD and was thinking what I would do in that. And I was doing something on Martin Luther, on the theology of the cross, and relating that to St. Paul's teaching on it. And I wanted another figure who was thinking about a similar theme. And so I happened to be rereading the Pensée around that time of life. As I read it, I thought, well, actually, Pascal talks quite a lot about the cross of Christ as a way of knowing God in a similar way that Luther did, but on the other side of the great sort of post-Reformation divide. And so I ended up doing part of my doctoral research on Blaise Pascal on a very narrow strand of it. And I remember thinking at the time, one day I will return and write a biography of Pascal, because even though then I was delving into a particular one small aspect of Pascal's thought, I just thought he had such an interesting life and was such an interesting man that I wanted to tell his story. And there hasn't really been a kind of major English biography of Pascal for quite a few decades now. And so I kind of returned to Pascal a few years ago and wrote the book, and that's the one that we're talking about today.
That's amazing. It's amazing to think about Luther and Pascal together, because really Luther was just 100 years or so earlier than Pascal, right? So it's like Pascal, was he actually interacting with some of Luther's thinking, or were you just making the connections between the two?
No, he didn't really interact with Luther. In fact, in fact, I don't think he actually had read Luther. He only mentions him once or twice in his writings, and at least on one occasion, he really doesn't understand Luther. He misunderstands him on his sacramental theology. But so I don't think he knew. He didn't know Luther firsthand, although, of course, as anyone in the 17th century would have known about Luther. But having said that, I think there is an interesting relationship between Luther's thought and Pascal's thought, in that they both have a particular place for the cross of Jesus Christ as a crucial criterion for knowing God. That somehow we know God through the cross, not sort of, separate from him. So they do live in different worlds. I think, we may come on to that. And I think one of the things that's sometimes said about Pascal is he's sometimes been called the first modern Christian. And he kind of speaks it into the modern world in a way that Luther kind of feels like he lives in a different world. I mean, Luther still has lots of things to say to our world, but he's living in a quite different world from ours. Whereas Pascal, I think there's some recognizable aspects of the cultural context in which he's placed. I think also Pascal has a very interesting relationship with Protestantism. He had to distance himself from Protestants because in 17th century France, it didn't look good to be, if you're a Catholic, to be associated with Protestants. The divide was really quite strong and quite visceral and quite bitter at the time. But although they do have some things in common, and I think the main thing they have in common is a real allegiance to St. Augustine, because Martin Luther and Blaise Pascal both looked at St. Augustine as one of the key shapers of their thought. They have both have strong doctrines of grace, a strong sense of faith. There are clear differences between them, but there are some similarities, even though Pascal didn't really know that they were similarities, I think, quite so much.
Yeah. That we recently just had Kenneth Wu on the podcast, and he wrote a book on John Calvin called The Refugee Theologian. And we talked a lot about the divide in Paris and in France in general about between Protestants and Catholics, and why Calvin had to flee France because of his Protestantism. And I was thinking about that in light of Pascal, thinking, yeah, there was a lot of religious tension at this time in Europe and in France in particular.
Yeah, that's right. And it's because Pascal is writing kind of with the memory of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which is this awful event where many Protestants in France were murdered by Catholics, and there were murders on the other side as well. It wasn't just one way, and so the divide between Protestants and Catholics was pretty severe at the time, which is why. Sometimes Pascal was accused by his opponent of being a kind of crypto-Calvinist. And of course, France was much more influenced by Calvinism than it was by Lutheranism, because Calvin, of course, himself was French, and he'd sent a lot of sort of Calvinist missionaries across the Alps from Switzerland into France. And they were often seen in France as a kind of fifth column, a sort of mysterious grouping that were against the French state and so on. And so you could experience quite a bit of persecution as a Protestant in France, which is why Pascal really wanted to distance himself, saying, I'm not a Protestant. And he would say, look, I'm very clearly not a Calvinist. And especially when he's writing on grace, he recognizes there is some difference. And he tries to place himself in between Calvinists on the one side and sort of Jesuits on the other, who have very, very different understandings of grace. And he wants to say, well, he's sort of similar in some ways because they both have this allegiance to St. Augustine, but he's different in many other ways. So it's part of his context, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll come back to that in between state he lived in, between the Calvinists and the Jesuits, because I think that's a really interesting kind of thread in his story. And I think it's helpful for today as well. But before we get there, why don't we can you put Blaise Pascal in a little bit more of a context? You call him the man who made the modern world. And obviously that's a big claim. So what was it about him that made you say that? I mean, it's a great title for a book, but like what about it is the truth that you saw that you could say that?
Yeah, I mean, it is a big claim, and partly it helps to sell the book, but it is something that I do think about quite a bit. And I suppose it's because so many of the things that we just take for granted in our modern world, they have Pascal's fingerprints all over them. So I mean, just imagine for a moment, you get up in the morning and you maybe you look at your watch and see what time it is. You go downstairs and you have your breakfast, and while you're doing your breakfast, you open your laptop and you maybe do some emails. You maybe look at the weather forecast that's coming for that day. Maybe you get some post comes through the door and there's maybe an insurance telling you about your insurance premium for your life insurance or your car insurance, and you check that out, and then you close it all up and you leave the house and you get a bus and you can travel into work, and you get to work and you sit down at your desk. Well, you've been up for maybe 2-3 hours in that morning, but everything you've done that day has been influenced by Pascal. So, for example, he was one of the very first people who wore his timepiece on his wrist rather than in his pocket, because he thought that was a bit easier to find the time by looking at your wrist rather than having to dig it out of your pocket all the time. So the wristwatch, that's kind of Pascal. The computer, Pascal made this extraordinary machine, this Pascaline, as he called it, which was a kind of adding machine. It was a kind of calculating machine which could do addition, subtraction, division, multiplication, up to tens and hundreds of millions. He did it to help his father, who was a tax official in France at the time. And it was not a great commercial success, but it's often seen as one of the very first working calculating machines in Europe. And so when the story of the computer is told, the journey towards the digital age, Pascaline is often part of that story. And in fact, in the 1970s, there was a computing language that was called Pascal, after him. The weather, he did a lot of experiments on atmospheric pressure, helping to establish that air has weight. And so that is part of the story about leaning towards the barometer and understanding air pressure and how weather works. Insurance, he basically invented probability theory along with Pierre de Fermat, listeners may have heard of Fermat's last theorem, a great mathematical problem that was recently solved. And Fermat was one of the greatest mathematicians of 17th century France. He and Pascal had a correspondence about this, where they worked out the whole basis of the science of probability. How do you work out the probability of things when you don't know the conclusion of a particular course of events? And that lies at the heart of all insurance. All insurance policies are based on probability. How probable it is you're going to have an accident in your car or live for a certain length of time. Most of our calculation of risk in the modern world is based on probability. And that is everywhere. We don't make anything without trying to calculate risk. And a lot of that goes to Pascal. And even buses. He basically invented buses. He had this idea towards the end of his life. He was conscious that the city of Paris probably doubled in size in the first half of the 17th century, which was fine for the rich because they could get around in their carriages. It was not great for the poor because if they wanted to visit family or travel to work, much greater distances. So he had this idea, well, what if we formed a company, raised some money from some wealthy people, bought up a whole series of carriages and got them to travel from point A to point B, stopping at various points along the way. Poorer people could get on the carriage, pay a small amount of money, 5 sous, 5 cents as it might be, and they could go as far as they wanted to, then get off, and the same thing would happen every day. And they established these carriages, 5 different routes across Paris. It was basically the first functioning regular urban transportation system in Europe, and it was all Pascal's idea. So just an example of the kind of sheer impact, the wristwatch, the computer, public transportation, probability, insurance, weather, all of that has got Pascal's fingers all over it. Not to speak of his impact upon theology and philosophy, which we could talk about in a moment, but that's really behind the idea that Pascal has his fingerprints all over so much of what we do in our modern world. That's why I think, we can call him one of the makers of the modern world.
Yeah, the way you describe the carriages and the routes and everything, it makes me think not only of bus routes, but also he invented the original Uber. He was like the Uber driver from the 17th century.
Yeah, he should be
That's
the
amazing.
of Uber drivers. Yeah, exactly.
It really blew my mind as I was reading your book, just how much he was at the beginning of all of these technological innovations. And he was seeing things as issues that could be optimized or solved or made better before anyone else was. And it is really incredible to see that and read in your book. Can you tell a little bit about how his father was involved in his life to shape him and to encourage him into the kind of prodigy he was?
Yeah, his father was Michael Etienne Pascal. In fact, Blaise's mother died when he was 3 years old, so he doesn't really remember his mother very well. And Pascal had 2 surviving sisters. He had one sister who died very young, but he had an older sister, Gilberte, who was a kind of slightly bossy older sister who organized all the rest of the kids in the family, very practical, very organized. And then a younger sister, Jacqueline, with whom he had a very intense relationship. She was a much more poetic soul, a very kind of sensitive person who, like Pascal, died young, but who was clearly very gifted with language, with words. She actually joined a convent, a Jansenist convent in life. She actually read a kind of treatise on education of children. So in her own way, she had an impact upon 17th century France as well. So that's kind of his family. But so Etienne, when Etienne's wife died, when the children's mother died, rather than marrying again, which was the normal thing that you would do in the 17th century, because of course people died young in those days, he decided to stay single, but he also decided to homeschool the kids, partly because he recognized that in his son Blaise, he had a bit of a genius on his hands, and also in Jacqueline as well. So he basically got a curriculum for them, teaching them at home, and he taught them Latin. He taught them. In fact, what he did was he thought mathematics should be kept until a bit later. You want to learn the basics first. You want to kind of learn Latin, learn Greek, learn the kind of languages in which educational, intellectual sort of operations happen. There's a story about how he suddenly stumbles upon Pascal, aged about 8, I think it was at the time, drawing some lines on the floor. And to his astonishment, he realizes that Pascal has basically discovered Euclidean geometry on his own without having read anything. And so he's on the one hand, cross with him because he's, well, you shouldn't be doing maths. That's not till later on in the curriculum. But on the other hand, he's clearly delighted because his son is such a genius. But he was also, Etienne was also a kind of aspiring intellectual. He lived in a place called Clermont, which is in the kind of middle of the south of France in a region called the Auvergne. And they lived there, but he felt that was a little bit constricted for him. He didn't have much of a strong intellectual, cultural life. And so, when Blaise Pascal is about 9 years old, he actually moves the family to Paris deliberately so that he can get involved in the kind of intellectual life of Paris. And so he goes to a circle led by a man called Marin Mersenne, who's a friar in the Order of the Minims. And that was a kind of great intellectual circle that debated all the big events and ideas of the time and the scientific discoveries. And so Pascal, through his father, was introduced to that intellectual world of discovery, really quite early on. He brought his son, so Etienne brought Blaise along, even though he was a teenager, to kind of talk to these kind of great intellectuals who are part of this grouping. And so that's, he had a big influence upon Pascal and that early intellectual development.
Yeah, I was struck too by how his sisters were involved in his life, both from the faith point of view, like the one who goes to join the Gentius, and also, was it the older sister, if I remember correctly, that was the one that wrote down a lot of these stories?
Yeah, so Gilbert, his older sister, wrote a kind of memoir of Pascal's life after he died, because by that stage Pascal had become a sort of pretty famous across France, across Europe, and so she writes down this reminiscence, and it's a little bit of the proud older sister, saying how wonderful her brother was. At times, you think there's a little bit of exaggeration here, and she's slightly a little bit of hagiography in it all. So you have to filter it a little bit with that. But it gives us important information about Pascal's life, and a lot of what we can reconstruct of Pascal's life comes from the work by Gilbert. But also his niece, called Marguerite, also wrote a kind of a story of Pascal's life. And so we do have a number of sources that tell us about the course of Pascal's life, one of which is his older sister Gilberte. But his younger sister Jacqueline was probably the one he was probably closest to. Pascal never married, didn't have any kids, but probably the woman that he was closest to in his life was his younger sister Jacqueline, with whom he had this very intense relationship. And it wasn't always easy. At times they had some strains in the relationship, particularly when Jacqueline decided to join this convent of the Jansenist movement. And again, we can talk about that in a moment, what that was. That caused some strain because it her going into the convent meant giving away some of her part of the family money to the convent, which for various complicated reasons was going to make the rest of the family much poorer. And that was a bit of a strain for them. And they went through a really difficult time in their relationship, but it was kind of healed in the end. They wrote these intense letters of spiritual journeying together. And so Jacqueline was a really important influence upon Pascal and an important sort of counterpoint to his spiritual development, I think.
I know at the end of his life, after his death, it was found there was something in his coat pocket, and it relates to this Night of Fire, it's called. And so, can you tell us a bit about that, this kind of pivotal spiritual moment in Pascal's life?
Yeah. Well, as I said a moment ago, Etienne moved the family to Paris, and from that time onwards, Pascal lived most of his life in Paris. They had a bit of time in Rouen. There was a time when Pascal's father had to escape Paris because he was in trouble with Richelieu, the kind of king's advisor, for various reasons. But most of Pascal's life was spent in Paris. And when he was in Paris, when he was a little bit older, through his 20s and early 30s, he went through what sometimes is called his worldly period. His période mondaine is the French word for it, where he basically became very kind of popular in the salons of Paris. He was going along to these places where witty conversation would happen. He would have all these sophisticated friends. He was engaged in his scientific researches. He was doing these mathematical problems, and he was becoming a bit of a sort of celebrity in Paris at the time. And I think Pascal always had a bit of a tussle in his life between this side of his life, being called to as a scientist, as a kind of public intellectual, as a mathematician, sort of lionized by all the people, the kind of successful people in Paris, and the kind of religious side of his life. In fact, his family had begun to be influenced by this movement known as Jansenism, which was a kind of spiritual movement in 17th century France, that goes back to a man called Cornelius Jansen, who wrote a very long book about Augustine. It was a very intense, quite serious movement. If you were a Jansenist, you were. It was very strong on human sin and the divine grace, spiritually austere kind of movement. And Pascal was sort of drawn to it. His sister, in particular, was drawn to it, to this movement. And Pascal was sort of partially drawn to it. So, but I think he had a bit of a tussle in his life. Is he the kind of famous public intellectual drawn by that life, or should he withdraw into the monastery like his sister to devote himself to God? And that kind of to and froing was a real struggle for him during this time. Now, in some ways, their tussle was not entirely resolved, but certainly put into a different light by this experience you were referring to, Travis, of what is sometimes called Pascal's Night of Fire. And it seems to be that we know exactly when it happened. It's November the 23rd, 1654, when it seems that he was in his room late one night in Paris, and I imagine he kind of sat down to pray. And then for this period, about 2 hours, he has this extraordinary close encounter with the presence of God. And he dates it exactly, 23rd of November. From 10:30 at night until midnight. For this 2-hour period, he has this intense experience. The reason we know about it, as you said, was not because he told anybody. He didn't. He told nobody at the time, not even Jacqueline, as far as we know. But when he died, and a number of years later, when one of the servants who was preparing his body for burial was cutting open his jacket, he felt there was something there, something in the lining, and he opened up the jacket, and out came 2 bits of paper on which were written 2 accounts of the same thing, or 2 versions of the same thing, and it reads like a poem. It's got the word fire, feu, right at the beginning, and then it goes on to describe in very poetic terms this intense encounter with God, and it has language of joy, certainty. He talks about, the God of Jesus Christ, not the God of the philosophers. This is a God who is encountered, the personal God of Jesus Christ, the God from whom he's been running away, but who has come to meet him in this dramatic encounter. And this encounter seemed to sort of change things in Pascal. It didn't mean he entirely gave up his scientific and mathematical work. He carried on that, but it took a smaller place in his life. It wasn't quite so crucial for him. And it had, I think, 2 particularly significant impacts on Pascal's life from that time onwards. And 2 priorities came into his mind. One was a fascination with the poor. He wanted to do everything he could to relieve poverty, not just to relieve poverty, but to live with the poor of Paris. He started giving away a lot of his possessions. He started doing whatever he could to give to the poor. The transportation system, the buses, that was about, how do you help poor people to get around Paris? So that's one thing. But the second thing is that he wants to somehow convince these sophisticated, suave, witty friends that he has in the salons who love him because of his fame and his mathematics and his physics and his philosophy, who they're all nominal Catholics, but they find God boring. He wants to convince them that they will find their true happiness in God, as he has done. And so he starts writing notes towards a great apology for the Christian religion. And again, we can tell the story of how those come to be, but that's basically the pensée. He never finishes it. He just writes these notes, and his family, when he dies, publish the notes as the pensée. And so that's really the significance of that key moment in Pascal's life. But as you say, Travis, it's a kind of pivotal moment in his life, this night of fire in November 1654.
Appreciate the way you describe how this night of fire led to this turning point. Not that he turned away from science and his maths, but that he was focused more, it seems like, on this spiritual calling in his life to serve the poor, to convince others that God is actually worth giving your life to. But Pascal is often brought into the faith versus reason debate or faith versus science debate. Um, can you talk a little bit about that? How did he see these two kind of worlds working together? Did he see conflicts? What was going on for Pascal? Or would that have been something he didn't even that wasn't even on his radar?
No, he was definitely on his radar, and clearly, as a scientist and as a mathematician, he does believe that reason, science, is a worthwhile exercise. He's sometimes described as a fideist, someone who believes that reason has no place at all in human life. That's not true. He's not a fideist. He's not a someone who thinks that only faith matters. He does think, that reason has a role to play in human life. He talks about a thing called the geometric mind. By that, he means that things like geometry, mathematics are very exact sciences. He played a role in the development of experimental science. Science, until that point, was often based on either the authority of the past. If Aristotle said it, it must be right. Or based on a priori philosophical principles. So Descartes, for example, does his scientific work on the basis of, you know, a priori principles. So, for example, one of the things that Pascal spent a lot of time on was the existence of a vacuum. Is there such a thing as a vacuum? Descartes thought there could not be a vacuum because a vacuum is nothing, and strictly speaking, nothing cannot exist. But Pascal thought, well, no, the way you find out things in science is by doing experiments. And so he did a series of experiments on the existence of the vacuum, which involved carrying bowls of mercury and tubes of glass up a mountain and measuring them up halfway up and at the top and so on. And by that was sometimes called the first proper modern experiment, one that was planned in advance, done several times, careful records made, published for peers to analyze and so on. That's a sort of key role. So he does think reason has a role in that. But he makes a big distinction between the world of science and physics and mathematics and the world of theology and the word of God, where he feels that reason has a limited scope. And that's not because he thinks that there aren't good reasons for believing in God. He thinks there are good reasons for believing in God. But this is the crucial thing. He thinks that they're not psychologically convincing for us because actually the way we are as fallen human beings means that that our reason is not as pure and doesn't work as the way it should have done in the first place. And this is an insight he gets from St. Augustine. He thinks actually that our hearts are stronger than our heads. Our longings are stronger than our logic. In other words, we kind of believe what we want to believe, that our desires are so strong and our desires are twisted into the direction of things that can never really make us happy, but look attractive on the surface, that our reason doesn't get us to God. And if we use our reason, our reason in the world of theology always makes us kind of move away from God rather than towards him. So again, it's not that he doesn't think there are good reasons, but he just doesn't think they really can get us to God. So he talks about, it's the heart that understands God, not the reason. And by heart, he means not emotion, not kind of romantic feelings, but he means a kind of deep instinct, a kind of deep sort of moral, spiritual instinct about God, which is about desire, which means that when he starts thinking about how you convince someone of Christian faith, he says this: first make it attractive, then make people wish it was true, and then show that it is. So not the other way around. I guess the classic way of apologetics that we sometimes do is to say, well, if we can amount sort of 10 fail-safe reasons why God exists, we'll convince someone that it's true. But Pascal says that doesn't work, because basically if someone doesn't want to believe, you can have as many reasons as you can, as you like. They'll always find a reason not to believe. You have to make it attractive. You have to make it desirable. You have to make it agreeable, because that's the way we work. That's the way we sort of accept things. That's the way we're led to believe certain things. So that's really something about his relationship between faith and reason.
I really appreciate that. It reminds me of something a pastor said to me back in a number of years ago. We were talking about how to share one's faith with another person. And we were talking about how we were talking about communication, and that for true communication to happen between two individuals, the other person actually has to hear and receive what's being communicated. And he talked about how the Christian witness, first and foremost, is like preparing a ground where people will actually receive, preparing the soil that people will actually receive what's being communicated. That if they're not attracted to it, if they don't, if there's like roadblocks because maybe you're a jerk, or you're, whatever, you're actually not a very great witness as a Christian, that actually prevents them from even getting to the point where they would consider what's being said. And I think there's something to what Pascal is getting at, that there is a sense of like the basic human condition is that like we have a lot of God-given resistance to anything that we think could be dangerous or not good for us, or we have all these self-defense mechanisms within us. And so yeah, communicating the Christian faith, a big part of it has to show that this is actually good. It's actually good news. And yeah, we can miss that sometimes, for sure.
Yeah, one of Pascal's most famous contemporaries was, of course, René Descartes, who was slightly older than Pascal. They actually met at one weekend. They met twice. They didn't get on very well. They both had big egos, I think, and probably was not going to be a great relationship. And it wasn't just because personally they clashed, but also they had very different understandings of things. In fact, they differ very strongly on this thing about reason and God. So Descartes, in his Discourse on Method, thinks he's found a kind of fairly fail-safe argument for the existence of God. He thinks he's found that, and he puts it out as a kind of philosophical argument for God's existence. So Descartes is a Christian. He's not an unbeliever, but he thinks he's found this reason to believe. Pascal, there's one of the pensées, one of the little sort of scribblings that he did, one of the shortest one, as in French it says Descartes. Incertain et inutile, so uncertain and useless. And I think it's quite a good guide as to why Pascal thought Descartes was uncertain and useless. He thinks he's uncertain because he thinks the kind of certainty that Descartes thought he'd found about God, you just can't have that kind of certainty. Because, one day you're convinced by the arguments. The next day, you've had a bad lunch. It's raining. You feel a bit different. You think, maybe I don't quite agree with it after all. Your feelings, your approach to things changes all the time. You can't have that level of certainty. Psychologically, it just doesn't work. Spiritually, it doesn't work for us. But also he thinks it's useless, slightly because he thinks that even if you did find that kind of certainty, the kind of God that Descartes gives you is a kind of a sort of rather thin, abstract God who is the kind of result of a philosophical argument. And that kind of God can't change your life. It's useless. It's a kind of something you might tick off. Yeah, I believe in God, and get on with the rest of your life. Whereas the God that Pascal had encountered on the night of fire was this live, kind of hunting God who came to hunt and to look out for Pascal, and who basically would you can only know God if you're prepared to really throw everything into this relationship with God. This is an intensely personal God that Pascal's talking about. And so he thinks that it's partly that you can't have this certainty, but also because the God that he leads you to is the God of the philosophers. And that's not the true God. The true God is the God of Jesus Christ, this God who consumes everything about us, who only if with this intense relationship with him can we find happiness and joy and the kind of sort of existential certainty that Pascal thought was possible, which is different from a kind of rational certainty, which is the kind that Descartes was after.
Yeah, the God of Jesus Christ is the God of the burning bush. Like he is all consuming but does not destroy. And that's so true. I love that because it's like this vision of God that says it's beginning with God is not uncontrollable. God is uncontrollable. And we can't determine what he's going to do. But then one night he might just show up in your life in a way that is something you cannot prepare for. You cannot even imagine it. Yeah, I think that's so powerful. I think that's a really powerful part of Pascal's story. And I think a lot of Christians can relate to that aspect of his story. Is like we follow God. Yeah, we not because of all of our doctrines and beliefs, though we have those, and those are really good, and those are really good for encouraging us and giving us a sense of understanding of the faith and who God is. But like we follow God because God encountered us. Like God showed up. And if he doesn't show up, then there's nothing. And I always think about that like, Sunday worship. Christians, we're so used to going to church, going to worship, spending time with other believers. But I'm always reminded it's like, yeah, unless God is there, it doesn't really matter. But if God shows up,
Yeah.
it changes everything.
Yeah. There's one other pensée, which is a slightly longer one, where Pascal really digs into this, and he says something like this. He says, the Christian's God is not the author of mathematical truths or the order of the elements. That's not the kind of God we're talking about. We're not talking about a God who just sort of is benevolent, like a kind of nice uncle who hands out nice things and allows you to kind of live and gives you a nice life, sort of thing. But he goes on to say this, which I always find a really compelling description of the God that Pascal talks about. He said, the God of the Christians is a God of love and consolation. He's a God who fills the heart and the soul of those who he possesses. He's a God who makes them inwardly aware of their wretchedness and his infinite mercy. He's a God who unites himself with them in the depths of their soul, who fills it with humility, with joy, with confidence, with love, who makes them incapable of having any other end but him. That's the kind of God Pascal is talking about. This personal God that you have a relationship with, an intense, transforming, converting relationship with, not a kind of abstract figure that you might or may not think exists or not in the distance.
Yeah, that's great. Well, as we wrap up our conversation, I want to finish with talking about Pascal and his views on distraction, because I think they're very applicable to today's life. And I want to read a quote that you quote him in your book. And Pascal says this: take away their diversion, and you will see them bored to extinction. Then they feel their nullity without recognizing it. For nothing could be more wretched than to be intolerably depressed as soon as one is reduced to introspection with no means of diversion. Wow. I read that and I'm just like, yeah, it is hard to sit in the quiet with nothing distracting you. And it was apparently hard in the 17th century, and it's probably 10x harder today. So tell us a little bit about Pascal and this focus on distraction that he says is pretty detrimental for our souls.
Yeah. Well, maybe a way into this, thinking about one particular way in which Pascal talks about God. He talks a lot about the hiddenness of God. He says about how, God is not obvious. You don't walk along the street and suddenly see God in front of you. He doesn't make himself obvious. He doesn't speak to you out of the clouds very often. So in other words, you can go through this life and just entirely miss the fact that God is there. He has some sympathy for atheists who think, well, I can't see God, I can't feel him, I can't hear him, therefore there cannot be a God. And he doesn't have much track for the Christian philosophers and apologists who say, well, I can show you God, I can prove God. And so Pascal, on the one hand, you've got the apologists, and there were apologists in his time who kind of thought there were there were these reasons that would convince the unbeliever. And then there were the atheists on the other side saying, well, we can't see God, so there is no God. And Pascal said, well, maybe there's a third option. And that is, there is a God, but he's a hidden God. And he hides himself from us, and he hides himself from us deliberately, and he always hides himself from us. And incidentally, he said about out of all the religions of the world, which one speaks of a hidden God? Well, Christianity does, because in the very place where we say God is most clearly revealed in the person of Jesus Christ, even there God is hidden. In other words, you could meet Jesus, you could see him face to face, you could shake his hand, and you could entirely miss the fact that you were talking to God. Because even in the flesh of Jesus Christ, God is hidden. And he would also talk about how, even in the sacrament, in the bread and wine of Holy Communion, God is somehow present. And of course, we have different understandings of how that works. But it just looks like bread and wine. It's and so on. So God is always hidden. And so he says, if that's the case, that God is there, but he's hidden from us, then he says the problem is that we don't always recognize God, and we get distracted by surface things, the things that we can see and feel and measure. And he said the problem with that is that it avoids something which I think is a distinct thing about Pascal. He actually believes there is a kind of profound sadness. There's an emptiness at the heart of human experience that every single person has. And that all our sort of political and political visions, our philosophical answers, are attempts to try to kind of to erase that emptiness, to kind of heal that sadness. But we can never quite do it, because what that sadness comes from is the fact that we've turned away from the God who alone can heal our sadness, who alone can can fill our emptiness. And he then says, but the thing is, we are very good at covering up that emptiness, good at distracting ourselves from this sadness that is at the heart, which is why he says things like this. He says, being unable to cure death, wretchedness, and ignorance, men have decided, in order to be happy, not to think about these things. So he has this theme of distraction, how we so easily distract ourselves. And in his day, he would talk about his friends who would go hunting or playing tennis or having witty conversation, attracting women, whatever it might be. Now, this for him was just a way of distracting themselves from the emptiness inside, which is why he will often say, well, if you doubt this, try this experiment. Sit in a room on your own for an hour or two with nothing to distract you. No books, no podcasts, no radio, no phone, nothing. It's pretty hard. You soon become aware that there is this emptiness inside. In our day, don't you? The minute you feel slightly bored or a little bit sort of, you just reach for your phone and scramble through some more little videos on TikTok or bits of news on the websites or whatever it might be. We are the most distracted age of them all. And so, he would notice how his friends, went hunting, and they were like disappointed when they caught the fox or the hare, because it was the chase and not the capture they wanted. He would talk about how, why do we travel the world if it's not because we want to, we're incapable of staying at home and just simply being alone, peaceful and ourselves, and so, so this theme of distraction, and what he draws attention to is our capacity for self-distraction as a way of covering up our emptiness and our sadness inside, which is, and it's only when we confront that, when we recognize it, when we are honest about it, that we suddenly begin to open ourselves to the possibility that that emptiness does need to be filled by the God who made us and the God who redeemed us in Jesus Christ. This hidden God who isn't apparent to us, but is the one who alone can satisfy that inner wound. So that's really what I think the theme of distraction is about: our capacity to distract ourselves from the very thing that will make from our emptiness, but also only through that can we find our true happiness.
And it's the God of Jesus Christ, as Pascal draws us back to, and what we've mentioned throughout this conversation. It's him who is the peace we long for, is the rest we want. So often, I think, when we hear conversations about our compulsion to distract ourselves, we then go to, okay, I need to figure out how to meditate more and how to rest more. But I don't think that's the answer either. It's no. Actually, these are all signposts that we aren't going to do it for ourselves. We're not able to save ourselves or to bring us to the place we need to be. These are signposts that should say, hey, look to that man from Nazareth. I was just preaching last Sunday on John 14, and even Jesus's disciples, they were like, God, if you're going to the Father, just show us the way. Or Philip's like, you could just reveal the Father to us and that'll be enough. And he's just constantly like, look to me. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Like, I am God hidden in this flesh. And when our distraction takes over and when we can't sit still, I mean, it's good to learn how to live life in a calmer, more relaxed way, but also that those are signs that we need someone outside of us to do this work. And that's what Jesus
and I think
has done.
one of the things that Pascal does for us is he helps us to understand what's going on when we scroll through our phones and when we reach for distraction whenever we feel slightly bored. That's not an accident. And he says, well, that's because we are desperately afraid of confronting the emptiness inside. But it's only by confronting the emptiness inside that we can find through that and begin to discover the one who alone can fill it. I mean, there's this well-known sort of passage where he writes about how this craving and this helplessness in human life, and he talks about what do they proclaim, but that there was once in man a true happiness of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. And this we try in vain to fill with everything around us, seeking in the things that are the things that we cannot find there, because actually none of those things can fill this infinite abyss, as he calls it, because the infinite abyss can only be filled by something infinite itself, which is by God and by the God of Jesus Christ. So that's really at the heart of what he's saying, and a lot of the pensée is kind of getting people to that point. Even his great argument of the wager, I think, is trying to get people to that point of confronting this, because that alone is the way through into discovering the God who alone can make us happy.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of Nietzsche and the you stare into the abyss and until the abyss stares back. But in this setting, it's like you have to stare into the abyss because in the abyss, God will actually meet you. It's like this, like, because that's the cross. That's where God shows up.
Exactly.
Um, well, Graham, I could talk to you all day, but I know podcast episodes can only go on so long before people need to turn them off and stare a little bit into their souls.
Exactly.
So, Graham, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate you, and I encourage everyone pick up a copy of Graham's book, Blaise Pascal, The Man Who Made the Modern World. You will not be disappointed. It is a fantastic, fantastic read.
Thanks, Travis. Really good to talk to you, and always fun to talk about Pascal. And all the best with the podcast.
Thank you.